The first frost had not yet come to the Atchafalaya Basin. The water still held the warmth of summer deep in its belly, and the cypress trees still wore their green needles, though in another week or two, the whole basin would turn the color of old gold. Prudence Pembroke stood in the stern of a dugout canoe and pushed a long pole against the muddy bottom, moving through the knee-deep shallows that bordered what used to be her husband's land. Harlan sat in the bow with his back to her. He had not turned around once in 2 hours. Colt sat at her feet, one small hand trailing through the brown water, watching the ripples spread and die. They had not been back since the spring. None of them had said a word since Pierre Part disappeared behind the first bend. The ruined cabin came into view around a stand of Tupelo gum. Prudence let the pole rest against the gunwale and stood still. The foundation stones were black with mud. The timbers that had formed the walls lay scattered for 60 yards in every direction, splintered where the flood had broken them apart like a man pulling apart a loaf of bread. The roof was gone, entirely taken downstream. She had been told it traveled as far as Morgan City before it caught on a sandbar and broke apart for good. Absalom had built that cabin with his own hands over 3 summers. He had been 28 when he started and 31 when the spring rise took both him and the house in the same cold week of April. Colt lifted his head and looked at the ruin. He looked for a long time without speaking, the way a child looks at something his mind cannot yet organize into a shape it recognizes. Then he looked up at his mother. "Mama, why did Papa die on the ground?" Prudence opened her mouth. Nothing came. She tried again and still nothing came because she did not have an answer yet, and she was not a woman who gave answers she did not have. Harlan did not turn around. They stayed only long enough for her to pull a burlap sack through the wreckage and fill it with salvageable nails, a good handful of iron hinges, and a cast iron kettle she found half buried in the silt near the old hearth. Then she pushed them back through 2 miles of bayou channel toward Pierre Part, where she and her boys had been sleeping in the back room of Widow Harker's boarding house for 6 weeks. The boarding house cost her $3 a week. In the tin box under her cot, she had $18 left. Colt's question rode with her the whole 2 miles back, sitting in the bow of the canoe, where Harlan sat heavier than either of her sons. She did not know yet why Absalom died on the ground, but she was beginning to understand that the answer to that question was the same as the answer to everything else she was facing, and that she could not move forward until she found it. The parish courthouse sat above the levee on the only ground in Pierre Part that did not flood in a wet spring. Prudence climbed the worn wooden steps alone the next morning and stood before the clerk's desk. "I need to know," she said, "what a widow's rights are." The clerk was a thin man with reading glasses and the practiced patience of someone who had answered this question before, always from women, always with that same careful flatness in their voices that meant they were holding something back. He explained without emotion. Louisiana was the only state in the Union that followed civil law rather than common law, its legal foundation drawn from the French Code Napoleon rather than the English common tradition. Under that system, a mother was the natural tutor of her minor children after the father's death. That protection existed and it was real. But it could be challenged by close male relatives on the father's side. If challenged, the court would weigh her fitness to serve as tutor, which meant it would look at her circumstances. "And if I have no dwelling," she said, "no fixed home, then fitness becomes harder to prove, Mrs. Pembroke. The court prefers stability, a fixed address, evidence that the children are housed and fed and schooled under one roof. I have no money to rebuild," she said. "The flood took everything. Then I cannot promise you an outcome." She thanked him. Her hands did not shake until she was back out on the street, standing in the September heat, with the sound of the river somewhere beyond the levee, and $18 between her and losing her sons. She had 3 days before Hargrove Buchanan arrived from Ohio. He came on a Wednesday, took a room at Widow Harker's boarding house, and paid for 2 full weeks in advance. He was 42 years old with thinning dark hair parted severely down the center, and a wool suit that was entirely wrong for the Louisiana heat. He carried a gold watch chain that caught the lamplight in the front parlor, and he had brought his own silver sugar spoon from Dayton, because he had opinions about the spoons in boarding houses. He invited Prudence to coffee the following morning. His voice was kind. That was the thing she would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward, the kindness of it, because it would have been easier if he had been cruel. He said he had come a long way out of genuine concern for his brother's boys. This swamp took Absalom. It was the nature of this place to take people. Surely she could see that. Absalom built above the waterline, she said. He believed he was safe. And he was wrong. That is precisely my point. Buchanan stirred sugar into his coffee with the silver spoon he had carried from Ohio. I will file the tutorship papers at the courthouse tomorrow morning. Harlan and Colt will be raised properly in Dayton. They will be schooled, fed, kept out of the disease and wildness of this place. I will manage their land inheritance until they come of age. It is the only decent course. She kept her hands very still on the table. Harlan is 14, he will not leave. Harlan is 14 and a minor child under Louisiana law. The sheriff will escort him if necessary. Buchanan's voice did not change. It stayed warm and measured. Prudence, you have no dwelling, you have no income, you have no male relative to stand witness for you in court. I am asking you to see reason. I am not your enemy. When is the court inspection? The last day of October. 90 days. She stood up from the table. Then I have 90 days. She went upstairs to the back room where Harlan and Colt were waiting. Colt was drawing on a slate with a piece of charcoal. Harlan was staring out the small window at the levee, which was what he did now when he was working something through, standing very still and watching the distance as if the answer might come down river. She sat on the edge of the cot without speaking. The lamp flame guttered in a draft from the warped window frame. Out beyond the town, a heron called once across the bayou and then fell silent. She had 90 days to build what no widow in this parish had ever built alone. What she did not yet know was that Hargrove Buchanan had arrived in Pierre Part 3 days before he took his room at the boarding house. She would not learn this until later from Horatio Dunmore, who had seen things and heard things in his years as parish notary and had developed a careful habit of recording them. Buchanan had spent those 3 days moving quietly through the town, calling on men who had known Absalom, men who had eaten at Absalom's table and borrowed his tools and stood at his graveside in April. He had offered each of them something useful, a contract, a debt forgiven, a promise of work. He had done this methodically the way a man does something he has planned in advance, before anyone knew to watch for it. By the time Prudence sat down to coffee with him in the front parlor, the town had already been prepared. Horatio Dunmore kept a small wooden building beside the courthouse, where he handled all matters requiring a public officer's seal, deeds, marriages, successions, wills, and the accumulated private knowledge that attached itself to a man who witnessed the important moments of other people's lives. He was 55 years old, wore wire-rimmed spectacles, and had a quiet, professional manner that people sometimes mistook for coldness. It was not coldness, it was discretion. He rose when Prudence entered and offered her a chair. I was sorry to hear about Absalom, he said. He did good work for my cousin once rebuilding a dock after the high water of '98. I remember he spoke well of you. I have 90 days, she said, to present a fit dwelling at the court inspection. My brother-in-law has filed for tutorship of my sons. I know, I recorded the petition yesterday. Dunmore removed his spectacles and polished them with a cloth from his desk drawer. I cannot advocate for you, Mrs. Pembroke. I am only a public officer, and there are limits to what that office allows. But I can inform. Inform me. He set his spectacles back on. Louisiana's Civil Code carries 2 provisions that matter directly to your situation. Article 15 speaks of the tutor's duty of care, which the code defines as care of the person of the minor child, not merely the provision of a fixed address. Article 1493 establishes forced heirship, meaning children cannot be disinherited, and their inherited share cannot be transferred to another party for that party's profit. Your sons already own the Cypress land. They inherited it from their father the moment he died. Hargrove Buchanan cannot take it from them. He can only control it by controlling them. She absorbed that. Then his interest is the timber. His interest is the timber, yes. Dunmore paused. There is a company, Williams Cypress Company. They purchase standing timber by the acre throughout this parish, and they keep detailed records of every inquiry they receive. If your brother-in-law made such an inquiry before he filed his tutorship petition, that sequence of events would constitute evidence of motive rather than family concern. Can you write to them? I cannot, but you can. And a letter that passes through this office carries the parish seal, which gives it a weight that a private letter does not carry. He paused again. There is one other thing. Your husband had a mentor when he was young, an old Cajun trapper and builder named Caleb Ashworth. He has lived on a floating camp structure on the open water for more than 40 years. I have not seen him in town this season. If he still lives, and I believe he does, He may be able to teach you something that no dwelling inspector in this parish has ever encountered. The river people of the Atchafalaya have their own ways of surviving what the rest of us cannot. He looked at her over his spectacles. I am telling you this as a neighbor, not as a notary. She thanked him. On the way out, she passed Roscoe Blackwell on the plank walkway that ran along the main street of Pierre Part. Roscoe was 48 years old and had been Absalom's oldest friend in this town. He had helped Absalom set the foundation stones of the cabin in the first summer of their marriage. He knew the weight of every timber in that ruin downstream. He knew where Absalom kept his tools and what hymns Absalom sang under his breath when he was working, and he had stood at the graveside in April with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into the shape of a man who has lost something real. He stopped when he saw her. He did not quite meet her eyes. Prudence, he said, I've heard about the petition. I know what you're going to ask me. She waited. I know you want me to stand up before the court and speak to your character, to say what I know about you as a mother and as Absalom's wife. He looked at the walkway boards. The thing is, I had a visit from Mr. Buchanan 2 days ago. He has a storage house going up east of town. He needs a finished carpenter for the interior floors, 3 weeks of work, guaranteed payment on delivery. I have a wife. I have 2 girls who need shoes before winter. She looked at him for a long moment. Absalom lent you $12 in the summer of '99, she said, for the cow. You never paid it back. Why not? Roscoe said nothing. Because Absalom was your friend, she said quietly, and now you are going to sell him. That is not a fair thing to say. Maybe not, she said, but it is a true one. She walked on. Roscoe did not call after her. That was when she understood the full shape of what Hargrove Buchanan had done in those 3 days before he took his room at the boarding house. He had not simply filed a legal petition. He had moved through the human architecture of her life and dismantled it piece by piece quietly before she knew to defend it. The legal proceeding was the visible orifice room. The town was the foundation underneath. She had 90 days in a town that had been turned against her before she started. The following Sunday afternoon, there was a knock at the door of her room at the boarding house. Reverend Lemuel stood in the hallway. He was 60 years old, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, and a voice that had spent decades learning how to carry weight. He had conducted Absalom's funeral service in April. He had said the right things over Absalom's grave. He came in and sat in the chair by the window. He said he came in the capacity of a pastor rather than an adversary. Mr. Buchanan, he said, has expressed his concern for Harlan and Colt to several members of the parish leadership. Out of that concern, he has placed $50 in trust through my office, designated for the care and resettlement of a deserving widow within this congregation. He asked me to speak with you directly. Prudence looked at him. What are the conditions? The Reverend did not answer that directly. He spoke instead about the children, about what they deserved, about the opportunities that existed for young men who were raised in stable circumstances with access to proper schooling. He said Ohio was cold, but the ground was solid. He said that the question a mother had to ask herself honestly was whether she was holding her children close for their benefit or for her own. That question stayed in the room after he left. She did not have a clean answer for it, and she knew that was intentional. A question you cannot answer cleanly is a question that keeps working on you in the dark. And Hargrove Buchanan had placed it there through a man in a collar, because a man in a collar carries a different kind of weight than a lawyer or a relative. The $50 was not charity. She understood that clearly. It was payment for the appearance of community support, and it had been arranged before she had a chance to build any support of her own. That evening, she sat at the small table in the back room with Absalom's journal open in front of her, and the civil code she had borrowed from Dunmore's shelf beside it. Colt had fallen asleep on the cot. Harlan came through the door while she was working. His palms reddened from a half day of chopping cypress wood for the boarding house kitchen. Widow Harker had paid him 15 cents. It was the first money Harlan Pembroke had ever earned. He saw her face when he came in and he stopped. She told him to sit down. She told him what they were going to do. Not the legal part, not yet. The building part. There were 4 large cypress trees on their land parcel, old growth standing in open water, that stayed at least 3 feet deep even at the driest point of the year. She would build a platform that floated anchored to those 4 trees by hemp ropes with loops large enough to slide up and down the trunks as the water rose and fell. The platform would carry a small house, a separate garden platform for rice and beans and winter squash, a small chicken run on its own floating section. They would never be flooded because they would rise with the water, and they would never be stranded because they would lower with it. Harlan listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Papa never did this. Why didn't Papa do this? Because Papa came from people who built on ground, she said. The old man I am going to find tomorrow, he offered to teach Papa once. Papa said no. He wanted to be a farmer, not a riverman. Was he wrong? She thought about that honestly. He was not wrong about what he wanted, she said. He was wrong about what this land would allow. The land here is water, Harlan. You cannot farm ground that disappears for half the year. Harlan looked down at his reddened palms. If I help, he said, can we keep Colt? Yes, we keep Colt. We keep each other. That is the whole point of it. He nodded once. Colt had woken up at some point during the conversation and was sitting up on the cot watching them both. He had the serious, measuring expression he wore when he was deciding whether something was as bad as it sounded or worse. Mama, he said, do we have enough time? Prudence looked at the calculations on the paper in front of her. $8 in materials at the outside, $10 left for flour and salt and coffee and lamp oil through the whole period of construction. 90 days, 4 cypress trees already standing on their own land. She looked at Colt. She did not answer him that night, but she did not look away. The first log they pulled from the bayou was longer than Prudence had calculated and heavier than anything she had lifted in her life. It took all 3 of them, Prudence in the water to her hips, Harlan braced against a cypress knee, Colt hauling on a length of hemp from the bank, and it still took the better part of a morning to drag it into position. When it finally rolled into place with a sound like a door closing, Colt sat down in the mud and laughed. Not from joy exactly, but from the particular relief of a body that has done more than it believed it could. Caleb Ashworth arrived 3 days later, paddled by his nephew in a flat-bottomed pirogue that moved through the channel like a water bird, low and unhurried. He was 74 years old and looked like something the basin itself had shaped over a long time, dark and weathered and very still, until he moved and then surprisingly quick. He stepped onto the bank, looked at what Prudence had already assembled, walked around it twice without speaking, and then said, "You have a good eye. Your husband did not, but you do." He came 3 days each week through the remainder of September. Some mornings his breathing was easy, and he worked 3 hours alongside them. Other mornings he arrived already tired and spent the time seated on a cypress stump at the water's edge, directing with his hands and his voice, while his nephew sat in the pirogue and waited with the patience of a man who had been doing this for years. He taught Colt the knots first because Colt had smaller hands, and the patience to repeat a motion until it became automatic. The bowline for permanent loops, the clove hitch for quick lashings, the timber hitch for the anchor loops that would connect the platform to the 4 cypress trunks. Each anchor loop had to be large enough to slide freely up and down the bark as the water rose and fell, never tied tight, always given room to travel. "This knot is the life of your mother and your brother," Pei told Colt, holding the boy's hands inside his own while Colt worked the rope around a trunk. "Pay attention the way you pay attention to nothing else. Do you hear me?" Colt heard him. What Caleb did not teach through instruction, he taught through silence. He had a way of watching Harlan work that communicated more than correction would have. Harlan was 14 and proud boys do not receive correction gracefully. But they can receive a silence that says, "Try again," without the sting of being told. Harlan tried again. Each time was better than the last. There was a morning in the second week when Colt fell from the bow of the canoe into 4 feet of brown water while reaching for a length of rope that had drifted loose. He went under completely and came up coughing and thrashing. Prudence was across the platform and started moving toward him. Caleb raised one hand and stopped her without looking at her. "Let him find the bottom," Caleb said. Colt found the bottom. He stood up. The water came to his chin. He pushed his wet hair back from his face and looked around, locating the rope, then the canoe, then his mother on the platform. Caleb nodded once. "That is what cypress does," he told Prudence quietly. "It does not fight. It finds what holds." She filed that away and kept working. The walls of the structure went up in the third week, salvaged cedar planks from the wreckage of Absalom's cabin, pulled from the mud and the tangled brush downshore over 3 afternoons. The planks were good still, only wanting to be planed clean of the silt that had packed into the grain. Absalom had chosen good lumber. That was the thing about him. He had known how to choose materials. He had simply chosen the wrong foundation for them. Colt sorted the planks by length each evening after the day's work was done, laying them in order along the bank so that Harlan could find the right size in the morning without searching. He did this without being asked which was Colt's particular character, the quiet maintenance of systems that other people forgot to think about. The cast iron stove came out of the mud of the old foundation in the fourth week heavy and sound, its legs bent slightly from the force of the flood, but its firebox intact. Harlan and Roscoe Blackwell carried it between them. Roscoe had appeared one morning without announcement. He stood at the edge of the bank with his hands in his pockets and watched for nearly an hour before he said anything. When he finally spoke, it was not to Prudence, but to the structure itself, the way a carpenter looks at another man's work and makes his private assessment before offering an opinion. Then he unlaced his boots, pulled them off, set them on a root above the waterline, and waded in. He worked the rest of that day and said very little. When Prudence handed him coffee at midday, he took it without meeting her eyes. When he finally left in the late afternoon, he paused at the bank and said, without turning around, Buchanan pulled the storage house contract. She said nothing. 3 weeks of work, he said. Gone. He stood there another moment. Absalom was my friend. That was all he said, and then he was gone through the trees. Prudence understood what it had cost him to come. She did not say so because Roscoe was not a man who needed to hear it said. Some things are better honored by receiving them plainly. What Roscoe did not know, and what Prudence would not learn until Dunmore told her 2 weeks later, was that Hargrove Buchanan had been watching. He had a list of every person who came to help with the construction. He had pulled Roscoe's contract the same afternoon Roscoe appeared on the bank. He pulled a firewood delivery agreement from a man named Lester Doyle 2 days after Doyle spent a morning helping Harlan notch the corner joints of the walls. He canceled a verbal agreement with Widow Harker's son over a fence repair job the week after the boy spent an afternoon helping Colt carry planks. Buchanan was not content to wait for the court. He was reshaping the conditions around the court while the court was still weeks away. It was methodical, and it was patient, and it was the kind of strategy that a man develops when he has money enough to make other people's decisions expensive. By the middle of September, the roof was on tin sheets salvaged from the ruin, hammered into overlapping rows by Harlan, working from a plank bridge balanced between the walls and the nearest tree. The chimney went up stone by stone, from the scattered remains of the old hearth, Colt handing pieces up to Harlan. Harlan fitting them into place with a mortar Caleb mixed from clay and river silt, in proportions he kept in his head from 40 years of building in wet country. Every evening when tools were put away and the fire was banked and Colt had fallen asleep, Prudence sat at the small table inside the floating house and read from the Civil Code. She had borrowed it from Dunmore's shelf, and she was not giving it back until she understood every word of the 2 articles that mattered. Not because the law would save her on its own, but because a woman who stands before a court should know the ground she is standing on better than the man who is trying to move her off it. Buchanan rode out to the construction site on a rented horse on a Tuesday morning in late September. He stopped at the bank and looked at the structure for a long time without speaking. The platform floated 6 inches above the water surface with Harlan and Colt and Caleb all standing on it, which meant it was carrying close to 500 pounds and still held steady. The walls were up, the roof was on, the chimney was half built. "What are you doing?" he finally said. Prudence did not look up from the rope she was splicing. Preparing for the inspection, she said, "Last day of October, I believe you said." "That is not a house. That is a floating shed." "It is a house," she said. "That floats." Buchanan sat on his horse and looked at the structure for another long moment. His face did not show what he was calculating, but she could feel the calculation happening, the way you can feel weather coming before the sky changes. He rode back toward town without another word. That evening, Dunmore told her later, Buchanan wrote a letter to a contact at William Cypress Company. It was a letter he would wish very much in the weeks that followed that he had never written. Reverend Onimuel came into the construction site on a Wednesday morning in early October. Not to the boarding house this time, but to the water's edge, where he could be seen and heard by whoever was working. He stood in his good clothes on the bank and called across the water, "Mrs. Pembroke, I have spoken with the parish council. There are 3 families willing to provide temporary housing for Harlan and Colt while you complete your arrangements. This would show the court that you are acting in the interest of your children rather than your own preferences." Prudence set down the hammer she was holding. She walked to the edge of the platform and looked at him across the water. Reverend Masiul, she said, do those three families know Hargrove Buchanan? The pause was short, but it was there. That is your answer, she said. And my answer is that my boys are staying with me. She picked up the hammer and went back to work. Lemuel stood on the bank a little longer and then left without speaking again. Harlan had watched the whole exchange from the far end of the platform without moving. When Lemuel was gone, he looked at his mother. She did not look back at him. She kept working. He understood from that there was nothing to be said about it and went back to his own work, which was the understanding she had been trying to build in him for weeks now without using words. 3 days after that, Caleb Ashworth arrived in the morning and could not leave the canoe unaided. His nephew had to help him onto the bank. His breathing had changed, a heavier, wetter quality to it that had not been there the week before. His face had the gray color that Prudence recognized from the last weeks of her father's life, a color that had nothing to do with the light. She made a bed for him in the small house. She carried his blankets from the pirogue and laid them on the raised platform she had built against the interior wall. Colt brought him water. Harlan built up the stove. The first occupant of the new floating house was the man who had taught her how to build it. He told them things about Absalom they had never heard. The boy of 15 who had come out into the basin for the first time with a borrowed knife and no real plan following Caleb because he had heard the old man knew how to survive in wet country, and Absalom had decided that was what he needed to know. The young man of 20 who had proposed marriage to Prudence from the back of a freight wagon because he had spent everything he had on the land and had nothing left for a sitting room. The way Absalom sang when he was working the same 3 hymns in rotation, always slightly off the melody, never caring. And then Caleb said the thing he had not yet said, the thing he had been carrying since April. I offered to teach him 3 times, Caleb said. He looked at the ceiling of the small house, at the tin roof above it, at something that was not in the room at all. 3 separate occasions over 4 years. The last time was in March, 6 weeks before the flood. He said he was a farmer, not a riverman. He said he wanted solid ground under him when he woke in the morning. I said I understood. And then I watched the spring come and the water rise, and I thought about that conversation every day for a month, and I could not decide whether I had failed him by not arguing harder, or whether a man has the right to choose his own ground, even when the ground is wrong. Colt sat very still beside the cot. Harlan stood in the doorway with his back to the room looking out at the water. I have been carrying that since April, Caleb said. I wanted you to know it. Not because it changes anything, but because Absalom deserved to have someone say it out loud. Harlan did not turn around, but Prudence saw his shoulders change. The cypress log that split came apart in the 3rd week of October when they had 9 days remaining, and the garden platform was still not secured. A full day of work undone, a log they could not replace before the following weekend. Prudence sat down on the platform with the heels of her hands pressed into her eyes. Mama Colt said from the water beside her, "It is only a log." "It is 7 days we do not have," she said. Caleb coughed for a full minute in the house behind her before his breathing settled. When he spoke, his voice came thin through the wall. "You will have another log by Tuesday," he said. "Sit down, drink some water." She did not believe him. She drank the water anyway. On Tuesday morning, before anyone else was awake, a cypress log 6 inches longer than the one that had split drifted into the anchor ring and stopped there as if it had been sent. Harlan and Colt had it secured before breakfast. Neither of them said anything about it. Some things you receive without explaining. The news about Deputy Jasper Cromwell came from Dunmore on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of October. Dunmore arrived at the boarding house after supper with the careful expression he wore when he had something to say that his office did not strictly permit him to say. "There is a matter," he said, "that I bring to you as a neighbor and not as a notary." He told her that Deputy Cromwell, the young deputy sheriff who had been posting himself at the water's edge 2 or 3 afternoons each week, had been filing written reports to Hargrove Buchanan. The reports covered the progress of construction, the names of anyone who came to assist, and the current physical condition of Caleb Ashworth. Nora sat with that for a moment. He has someone inside the sheriff's department. He has someone young who needs his position and who was approached before he had time to think carefully about what he was agreeing to, Dunmore said. "There is a difference. Does it change what I need to do?" "It changes the timeline." Dunmore set both hands flat on the table. "The weather office in Port Allen issued a forecast this morning. There is a Gulf system moving north. It will reach this part of the basin by the weekend. Mr. Buchanan is aware of the forecast. He has made arrangements to be at the water's edge the morning after the storm with Sheriff Holt as a witness. He is waiting for the storm to do his work, she said. He is betting that the structure will not survive, Dunmore said, and that whatever damage it takes will be sufficient grounds for the inspector to declare it unfit before the formal inspection even takes place. She looked at the window. The evening was still and warm with that particular quality that comes before a Gulf storm, heavy and suspended. What I can tell you, Dunmore said carefully, is that if your 3 documents are filed with the court as a pre-inspection submission before 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, they enter the formal court record before the inspection occurs. At that point, Mr. Buchanan's attorney cannot move to exclude them during the inspection itself on procedural grounds, which I am told is the strategy currently being prepared. She looked at him. You are telling me to file before the storm. I am telling you that Friday is 4 days before the inspection. Dunmore stood up from the table and buttoned his coat. I am telling you nothing else. The storm came on a Saturday, arriving in the late afternoon with the warmth and weight of late Gulf summer still in it. The wind moved through the cypress canopy and flattened it sideways. Harlan was not there. He had gone into town 3 days earlier after a short argument about something small, the kind of argument that is really about something much larger, and had not come back. He was staying with his aunt, and Prudence had decided to let him have the time. Prudence and Colt closed the stove damper and latched the window shutters and sat together on the cot in the dark of the small house while the storm pushed against the walls. The platform rocked, but the 3 remaining anchor ropes held. Colt pressed against her side and did not speak. She put her arm around him and kept it there. Around midnight, the wind shifted. At 3 in the morning, the northwest anchor rope separated with a sound like a rifle crack. The platform swung hard on its 3 remaining anchors. The northwest corner drove into a submerged cypress knee with a force that traveled up through the floor and into Prudence's feet, where she stood bracing against the wall. The lower seam of the hull split along a 6-inch run. Water began coming in at the garden platform, first slow and black in the darkness. She found the tin pail in the dark by feel. She bailed. Colt found a wooden bowl and bailed beside her. They worked through the rest of the night without speaking. 2 people doing the only thing there was to do, and the water kept coming in at the split seam, and they kept moving it back out, and that was the whole of it until the sky began to gray in the east and the wind finally dropped. When the light came up, she could see the full damage. The northwest anchor hung loose in the water, its end frayed where it had parted. The garden platform listed at a 5-degree angle. The potato rows were underwater. The cabbage heads had taken on water and were soft. Only the rice still stood straight, the rice still green and upright in its flooded rows, because rice had been growing in water since before anyone in Louisiana was born. She was sitting on the tilted edge of the porch with her hands in her lap, too tired to stand when she heard the horse. Hargrove Buchanan came through the trees on the far bank with Sheriff Holt beside him. Holt was a heavy man in his 50s, unhurried with the watchful quality of someone who has learned that what he sees is not always what is actually happening. Mrs. Pembroke Buchanan called across the water. His voice was measured and not unkind. I heard there was damage last night. I have brought the sheriff as a witness to the current state of the property. This confirms what I have said for 9 weeks. The inspection is 1 week from today. I advise you with all the compassion I can offer to pack your things now and spare yourself and your boys the humiliation of a formal finding. Prudence did not answer. Buchanan waited. Mrs. Pembroke, do you hear me? I hear you, Hargrove. And your response? My response is that the inspection is 1 week from today. Buchanan turned his horse and rode back into the trees. Sheriff Holt did not turn. He sat on his horse and looked at the structure for a long time, taking in the cracked seam, the tilted garden platform, the loose anchor hanging in the water. Then he looked past the structure at the ruin of Absalom's cabin on the high ground beyond, visible through the trees, walls down roof, gone timbers scattered in all directions, unmoved by the storm, because there was nothing left of it to move. He said quietly enough that only she could hear across the water, Mrs. Pembroke. That structure behind your house on the high ground, that was your late husband's cabin. Yes, it killed him. Yes, she waited. Which one is still standing this morning? She looked at the floating house. Tilted. 1 anchor gone. Garden half drowned. Still carrying Colt, who had come to the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and was watching the man on the horse with the careful attention of a child who understands that something important is being decided. Mine is, she said. Sheriff Holt nodded once. He touched the brim of his hat. 1 week, Mrs. Pembroke. Then he turned his horse and rode after Buchanan without another word. Colt came and sat beside her. He handed her one of the cups. They drank in silence while the sun came the rest of the way up and the water held them tilted, but held them, and the rice stood in its rows in the flooded garden, straight and green and entirely unbothered by everything that had happened in the night. That evening, after Colt had finally slept, Prudence lit the lamp and sat alone at the small table inside the house. She took out paper and Absalom's pen, and she began to write a letter of surrender. She wrote 2 paragraphs, and the words looked strange to her, correct and complete, and entirely wrong in a way she could not immediately name. Colt came out of his blanket sometime after midnight and asked if she was coming to bed. She set the letter on the table. She did not put it away. She left it there in the lamplight where she could see it, and she went to bed, and she lay awake for a long time in the dark, listening to the water move under the house, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, she finally slept. She woke before dawn. The storm had left a chill. She built a fire in the stove and made coffee and sat in the lamplight looking at the letter on the table and thinking about Buchanan's voice when he called across the water. Not cruel, never cruel. That was the thing that had been working in her since April, the thing she had not yet been able to name clearly. Absalom had also never been cruel. Absalom had also been completely certain he was right, and the water had taken him anyway, without cruelty or intention, simply because certainty is not the same as safety, and the basin does not negotiate. She reached across the table and took down Absalom's journal from the shelf above the stove. She opened it without looking for anything in particular and read. She read for a long time, turning pages in the lamplight, not searching, just reading the way you walk through a house you have lived in for years, looking for something you cannot name. She found the entry 40 pages in from the 3rd summer of their marriage. The ink was slightly faded. Absalom had written only 6 lines. She read them twice. Then she set the journal on the table next to the unfinished letter and sat very still while the stove ticked and the water moved under the house, and Colt breathed evenly in his blankets. Absalom had known. He had written it down in the 3rd summer of their marriage and never spoken it aloud and carried it the rest of his life. He had written that he understood why Caleb built on the water instead of the ground. He had written that he understood it was the right way for this land. And then he had written that he could not do it, not because he did not know better, but because he did not know how to be a man in this place and let the ground move under him. And he did not know how to learn that without becoming someone his father would not recognize. She understood for the first time that whatever came next was not going to come from the letter on the table. She reached across the table and picked up the Northwest anchor rope. It had been coiled on the table since the night before, brought in from the porch where Caleb's nephew had left it before his last visit. She turned the frayed end in her hands, found the knot she had tied, and looked at it in the growing light. Wound twice around the trunk and then back through itself. She had tightened it herself, standing in the water up to her knees, pulling the loop down hard, and then pulling again because she was afraid. She had been so afraid of losing the rope that she had tied it so that it could not move. And a rope that cannot move in a flood does not hold. It breaks. She had tied it the way Absalom had built the cabin, against the thing she feared not with it. She sat on the porch with the coiled rope across her knees and let the understanding settle into her, the way water settles into wood slowly into all the grain. She cried without sound for a while, for Absalom, who had known and could not act on what he knew, for Caleb, who had tried and been refused and had carried the weight of that refusal to his grave, for herself, for the 2 times she had stood in the water and pulled that knot down tight and told herself it was caution when it was really fear wearing caution's face. Then she stopped. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She went inside and woke Colt. "Get dressed," she said. "We are going to do this right today." "Do what, Mama?" "Let the rope go. Properly this time." She left Colt on the platform with a clear set of tasks and took the canoe into Pierre Part at first light. The town was quiet, the morning mist still on the water, the main street empty, except for a dog sleeping across the doorway of the hardware store. She found Harlan behind his aunt's house splitting wood. He had been at it for 3 days, and it showed in the pile beside him, which was large enough to keep the household through most of winter. He did not look up when she came around the corner of the house. "Harlan," she said. He drove the axe into the block and left it there. "Harlan, I need you." "For what?" "To come home. To retie 3 of the anchor ropes. To tie the fourth one yourself the way Caleb taught you with your own hands. He picked up the axe and drove it into the block again. I already know how to tie it. You know how to tie it tight, she said. I need you to tie it loose. There is a difference I did not understand until last night. He stopped. He held the axe at his side and looked at her for the first time. His face had the quality it always had after he had been working through something hard, a flatness that was not coldness, but exhaustion from the effort of holding opposing things at the same time. Why would you let me? He said. I am 14. Papa was wrong not to let you, she said. Papa wrote in his journal that he knew he was wrong. Let me show you what he wrote. She had brought the journal. She held it out to him. He took it with one hand, the axe still in the other. He read the page. He read it twice. His face did not change on the outside, but something shifted behind his eyes, the way light shifts on water when a cloud moves, barely visible but real. He set the axe down against the woodpile. He gave the journal back to her. Show me the knot, he said. They went back to the platform together. The morning was cool and the mist was lifting off the water. Colt had the tools laid out in order along the starboard edge, rope lengths coiled and ready. She demonstrated the knot once with her hands moving slowly through each position. The loop had to be large enough to allow the rope to travel freely as the water moved, placed against the bark with give rather than tension. Harlan watched. Then he took the rope and tied the first one. It was not perfect. The loop was a little small. She adjusted it with 2 fingers, opening it just enough. Better. Try the second. The second was better. The third was good, clean, and easy. The loop generous. The hitch settled against the cypress with exactly the right amount of give. She had saved the 4th rope for this. She had cut it that morning from the coil. Caleb's nephew had left behind the coil of old hemp that Caleb himself had braided years before. She had not told Harlan where the rope came from. She knew and he did not, and she made a decision in the moment to let him tie that last knot without the weight of knowing. Some burdens you carry for your children until they are ready. She handed him the rope and walked to the far end of the platform. She looked out at the water. Done, Mama. She walked back and looked at the knot. The loop was the largest of the 4, open and easy, against the cypress bark, room to travel 6 feet in either direction as the water moved. The hitch was placed without tension. It was the best of the 4. Caleb would have said good work, she told him. Harlan looked at the knot. He put one hand on the rope, not gripping, just resting it there, feeling the hemp against his palm. Then he nodded once and went to find Colt. By noon, all 4 anchors were set. By mid-afternoon, a light rain had begun to fall, and the basin was rising slowly and evenly, the way it rose when the system was steady rather than violent. 2 inches, then 4, then 6. Each rope loop traveled up its cypress trunk without a sound, without resistance, and the platform lifted with the water as if it had always lived there, as if this was simply what it did. Colt stood on the porch and counted the inches aloud as the platform rose. 7, 8, 9. He called back over his shoulder. Mama, we stay up. We stay up as long as we let the rope slide, she said. 3 days remained until the court inspection. The evening before the inspection, Deputy Jasper Cromwell paddled a borrowed canoe to the floating house alone. No badge, no uniform. He tied up at the porch post and called in without stepping aboard. Prudence came to the doorway. Mrs. Pembroke, he said, I need to speak with you privately. She told Colt to stay inside and stepped out to the porch. Cromwell was 26 years old and had the look of a man who had recently made a decision that surprised himself. He told her plainly what Buchanan's lawyer intended to move at the start of the inspection, to exclude all 3 of her documents on the grounds that she lacked proper standing as a petitioner under Louisiana procedural rules. The argument was thin, but it would create delay, and Buchanan was betting that delay would cost her more than it cost him. The documents had to be in the court record before the inspection began. If they were filed as a pre-inspection submission today, before 5 o'clock, Buchanan's lawyer could not touch them in the inspection room. They would already be evidence. Why are you telling me this? She said. Your husband, Absalom Pembroke, fixed the whole seam on my father's fishing boat the summer I was 12 years old. He would not take any payment for it. He said a man who leaves a neighbor's boat leaking is not a man who deserves a dry one. I have been trying to decide for 3 weeks whether I was the kind of man Absalom Pembroke would have recognized. I have decided I want to be. He untied his canoe and paddled back to shore without waiting for her response. Prudence had the canoe in the water inside 5 minutes. She reached Dunmore's office at 3:30. She handed him the 3 documents. He notarized them in order without speaking until he had finished. The first Article 15, the tutor's duty of care, as care of the person rather than provision of an address. The second Article 1493, the forced heirship provision, establishing her sons as owners of the land. The third, the William Cypress letter, parish sealed, confirming that on the 23rd of August, 6 days before Hargrove Buchanan filed his tutorship petition, a Mr. H. Buchanan of Dayton, Ohio, had written to inquire about the value of standing timber on the Pembroke parcel. The company's response had quoted approximately $2,400 for cutting rights on the old-growth cypress. Dunmore folded the sealed envelope and looked up. "You have 22 minutes. She walked to the courthouse. The clerk on duty stamped the envelope and entered it in the pre-inspection submission log. Prudence kept the receipt in her coat pocket and did not let go of it until she was back on the water. The last day of October came in warm and clear, with a sky the color of washed glass and no wind. Prudence was on the porch before sunrise. Colt was already awake in his cleanest shirt, eating cold rice from a bowl and watching the East Bank with the concentrated attention he brought to things that mattered. Harlan stood at the northwest corner of the platform, one hand resting on the anchor rope he had tied himself. Hargrove Buchanan arrived at the East Bank at 9 o'clock with his lawyer and Sheriff Holt. The lawyer was a thin man from Ohio named Branch, who had come down by rail and looked like a man who was already calculating the cost of the return trip. Their horses stopped at the end of the path where the land gave way to open water. There was no dry causeway. Prudence pulled the canoe to the bank and set the paddle across the gunnels. "Gentlemen," she said, "I can carry one at a time, sheriff first by law. Mr. Buchanan and Mr. Branch may observe from the bank." Buchanan began to speak. Branch touched his arm and said something low. Prudence heard only 2 words, civil code. Buchanan stopped. Sheriff Holt stepped into the canoe without being asked twice. He sat in the bow and did not speak during the 40-yard crossing. He watched the 4 cypress trunks as they approached, and the rope loops on each trunk and the platform rising and settling with the very slight movement of the water. His face gave nothing away. Colt met them at the edge of the porch. He introduced himself and said he was 8 years old and that he could answer questions about the house if the sheriff had any. Sheriff Holt looked at him for a moment and then said he did have some questions. He asked about the garden. Colt named each row without hesitation. Rice, corn, beans, winter squash. He explained that the potato crop had been lost in the storm and the cabbage had been damaged, but the rice had come through because rice knew how to be in water. Sheriff Holt wrote something in his notebook. He asked about the chickens. Colt answered, 8 hens, 4 to 5 eggs a day, depending on the weather, sold through Widow Harker's kitchen for egg money, which had paid for 2 arithmetic primers and a collection of verse that were currently on the shelf inside. He asked to see the food stores. Prudence opened the cabinet. Salt preserved fish in 5 sealed jars, dried beans in 3 crocks, flour in a lidded tin, coffee, rice in a burlap sack. He looked at it all and wrote in his notebook. He asked about the chimney. He stepped inside and looked up the flue. He asked about drinking water. She showed him the 2 rain barrels on the porch, both full from the week's weather. He asked about schooling. She opened the shelf beside the stove. The Bible, a Louisiana reader. The Civil Code, Absalom's Journal. A verse collection. 2 arithmetic primers, a primer on natural history that Colt had found in Widow Harker's discard pile and asked permission to keep. He looked at the shelf for a moment. He wrote in his notebook. He asked Harlan about the anchor ropes. Harlan walked him to each of the 4 cypress trees in turn. At each one, he demonstrated the loop, pulling it up and pushing it down along the bark to show how freely it moved. He showed Holt the old waterline marks on the trunks, the dark stains left by the 6 weeks of rising and falling water since construction was complete. 6 feet of variance, he said. The platform traveled the full range each time without strain. Holt put his hand on the northwest rope, the one Harlan had tied, and worked the loop up and down the trunk himself. He did not say anything. He wrote in his notebook. A light shower passed through in the last minutes of the inspection, brief and soft, the kind of rain the basin produces in October without meaning anything by it. Holt stood on the porch and watched the northwest rope loop rise 2 inches as the platform lifted with the freshening water. His face changed then, not dramatically, just a small adjustment around the eyes. The look of a man who has seen something resolve into a shape he can describe accurately. "Mrs. Pembroke," he said, "is there anything else you wish to enter for the court record?" "Three documents," she said, "all notarized by Mr. Dunmore and already entered into the court record as a pre-inspection submission yesterday afternoon." She handed him the copy she had prepared. He read the first document, the second, then the third. When he reached the William Cypress letter, he slowed down. He read it through once and then read it again. He folded all three documents and placed them inside his coat. "I have seen enough," he said. She paddled him back to the bank. He did not step down from the canoe when they reached it. He looked across the water at Hargrove Buchanan, who was standing at the bank with Branch beside him, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the still morning air. "Mr. Buchanan, I will see you at the courthouse tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Bring your counsel." Buchanan's face changed in a way she had not seen before. The careful management he maintained over his expression slipped for just a moment, long enough to show something underneath that was not composure. "Sheriff," he said, "I trust you found the dwelling to be in a condition that—" "I found the dwelling functional and occupied," Holt said. "I have three documents that will be read into the record tomorrow before the parish judge. 9 o'clock. He handed the canoe painter to Colt, who had waded in to take it and mounted his horse without another word. He rode back through the trees without looking at Buchanan again. Buchanan stood on the bank for a moment. He looked at Prudence across the water. She looked back at him. There was nothing in her face that she was trying to communicate to him. She was simply looking the way you look at something that has occupied your attention for a long time and no longer requires it. He rode after Holt. Branch followed. Colt was standing knee-deep in the water, still holding the canoe painter, watching them go. Then he looked at his mother. "Is it over?" he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "Come out of the water." The hearing the following morning was brief. The parish judge was a small man of 60, with a manner that suggested he had long since stopped being surprised by the variety of human folly that came before him. He heard Sheriff Holt's report first. Then he had the three documents read into the record by the court clerk. What happened in the room when the William Cypress letter was read, when the clerk reached the figure of $2,400 and read it aloud in the flat, recitative voice of a man reading? Figures was that the room went entirely quiet. Not the quiet of shock exactly, but the quiet of a thing becoming visible, that everyone had been looking at from the wrong angle. Hargrove Buchanan said nothing. He sat very still. Branch spoke briefly in his place, making an argument about procedural standing that sounded less convincing with each sentence. Then there was a development that Buchanan had not anticipated. Deputy Jasper Cromwell was seated in the back row of the gallery. He had come in quietly before the hearing opened in civilian clothes without his badge. When the judge finished with Branch's argument and asked if there was additional testimony, Sheriff Holt stood and indicated that Deputy Cromwell was present and willing to give a statement. Cromwell walked to the front of the room. He was 26 years old and looked younger than that under the gallery lights. He gave his name and his position and then stated plainly and without elaboration that beginning in the second week of September, he had filed 8 written reports to Hargrove Buchanan regarding the progress of construction at the Pembroke Floating House, the names of persons who assisted with construction, and the physical condition of Caleb Ashworth, who was residing on the property. He stated that he had done this at Mr. Buchanan's request and in exchange for the assurance that his employment would be secure regardless of how the tutorship matter was decided. He stated that he regretted it. Buchanan turned to look at Cromwell. Cromwell did not look back at him. The judge's ruling came in the 4 sentences. The tutorship petition was denied. The floating dwelling was found to be safe, functional, and sufficient for the housing of minor children. The mother was confirmed as natural tutor of her sons under Article 15. The petitioner was ordered to pay court costs of $18 and prohibited from refiling absent substantial new material evidence. Prudence walked out of the courthouse into a cold, clear morning with Horatio Dunmore beside her. Harlan and Colt were waiting on the steps. Colt was sitting on the top step with his elbows on his knees. Harlan was standing with his hands in his pockets and his face tilted up slightly toward the sky, which was the posture he assumed when he was deciding how he felt about something. "Let's go home," Prudence said. "Home," Colt said and stood up. 3 weeks after the ruling, Reverend Lemuel knocked on the side of the floating house from a canoe he had borrowed from someone down the bank. It was evening. He was in work clothes, not his good ones, and he looked like a man who had spent time deciding whether to come and had finally decided the deciding was worse than the coming. He tied the canoe to the porch post and came aboard. He sat in the chair Colt brought him and put both hands on his knees. He placed $30 on the small tabletone between them. The 50 that Buchanan had given him less 20 he had already put into the church building fund before he understood clearly what he had agreed to be part of. "I do not know how to explain this," he said, "other than to say that I was wrong. I was told I was helping those boys, and I wanted to believe it because it cost me nothing to believe it, and now I see that wanting to believe something is not the same as having reason to." Prudence looked at the money. She looked at him. "You asked me a question," she said, "whether I was holding my children close for their benefit or for my own. I remember. The answer is both," she said, "and I have decided that is not a thing that needs to be apologized for." She pushed the money back toward him. "Take it back to the church," she said. "Absalom put money in that church every year he was alive. Uses it for something he would have recognized." Lemuel sat with that for a moment. He picked up the money. He stood up. "You are a better person than I have been," he said. "No," she said, "I am a person who learned what happens when you hold a rope too tight. That is all." He left without ceremony, paddling back across the still water in the borrowed canoe, and she watched him go until he was around the first cypress stand and out of sight. 2 springs later, a young woman named Dorothea Caldwell pulled a leaking skiff to the side of the floating house before sunup with 2 small children in the bow and a creditor 3 days behind her. She had heard about Prudence Pembroke from a woman in Port Allen who had heard from someone else the way useful information travels through communities of women who have learned the hard way what is useful. Prudence took her in. Dorothea stayed 14 weeks. She learned to read the Civil Code by lantern light in the evenings, Article 15 and Article 1493. The names of the provisions that protected widows and the names of the provisions that protected their children. And she learned to write a letter that could carry a parish seal. She learned to fall a cypress log and lash a raft platform and plant a floating garden in rows that would not tip in wind. She learned the knots. She built her own floating house 2 miles west along the basin and named her first daughter Miriam Ashworth after the man whose work had made all of it possible. Roscoe Blackwell, who had lost Buchanan's storage house contract the day he waited out to help with the Pembroke construction, became the man other widows called when they needed someone who knew how to work cypress in wet country. He built or helped to build 7 floating structures over the following decade, and he did not charge for his labor on any of them. When people asked him why, he said he owed a debt that took more than money to settle. He did not explain further, and people stopped asking. Deputy Jasper Cromwell was dismissed from the sheriff's department 2 weeks after the hearing, as he had expected. He found work on a survey crew operating along the Gulf Coast and was eventually hired by the parish land office, where he served for 28 years. He was never again offered money to watch someone he had agreed to protect. Hargrove Buchanan returned to Dayton after the hearing and did not come back to Louisiana. The small land speculations he had planned to fund with cypress timber rights came to nothing over the following years. He died alone in a rented room in Dayton in the winter of 1919. No wife, no children, his accounts in modest disorder. The news reached Prudence by way of a letter from the Dayton County Clerk's office inquiring whether she had a claim against the estate. She wrote back that she did not. Horatio Dunmore served as parish notary for 22 more years after the Pembroke case. In his final annual report before retirement, he noted that he had written over the course of his career 141 parish-sealed letters of the kind Prudence Pembroke had first requested from him in September of 1903. Letters of inquiry directed to timber companies, land speculators, and holding agents, establishing the sequence of financial interest before legal action. Of those 141 letters he wrote, 112 had contributed to the denial of tutorship petitions filed against widows in this and neighboring parishes. He considered this, he wrote, the most useful work he had done. Harlan Pembroke grew into a builder. At 22, he married a Cajun woman from a floating family on Bayou South, a woman who had grown up understanding the water the way her parents had taught her to understand it, as a condition of life rather than an obstacle to it. At 25, he had built 16 structures of his own design, each with a 4-anchor system, each with a floating garden platform, each with a small shelf beside the stove that held a civil code, a Bible, and a hand-copied version of his father's journal, which Harlan had transcribed himself for every family that moved into a house he built. He did not charge extra for the copy. He said it was part of the house. Colt became a teacher. He ran a school in a floating schoolhouse on the West Basin for 31 years. He taught reading and arithmetic and natural history and every autumn a session on the Civil Code of Louisiana that was not required by the state curriculum, and that the parish school board occasionally threatened to remove from the syllabus and never quite did. He retired at 62 and moved his floating house 200 yards east next to his mother's, so he could watch the sunrise from her porch in the mornings. The floating house itself was rebuilt twice over 40 years once, after a fire from a lamp overturned in a bad storm in 1914, and once after a rot in the lower planks that Harlan caught before it became structural failure. Both times the same 4 cypress trees were used as anchor points. Both times Harlan tied the ropes. By the second rebuilding, those trees had grown 9 feet taller than they had been the morning Caleb Ashworth first pointed to them and said, "These are your foundation." In the last year of her life, Prudence sat one October evening on the porch of that house and watched her granddaughter paddle in from the West Channel. The girl was 6 years old, small for her age, with the serious, focused expression that ran through the Pembroke children like a thread. Her name was Verdena, for no one in particular, which was how her father had named her, saying that some people arrive new and do not need to carry a history before they have made their own. The girl tied her canoe to the porch post the way Colt had taught her, clove hitched twice around, and climbed up onto the porch with a stack of slate boards under one arm and a question already forming on her face. She climbed onto Prudence's lap without asking permission, which was her habit, and settled in with the slate boards across her knees. "Tell me the story," she said. "Which one?" "The one about why we live on water." Prudence looked out at the 4 ropes on the 4 cypress trees. The light was going the sky behind the canopy, moving from gold to a deep settled blue, the water below it very still and very dark. "Your great-grandfather Absalom," she said, "was a good man who loved this land and wanted to live on it honestly and build something that would last. He was brave and he worked hard, and he was not wrong about what he wanted. He was wrong about the way he tried to hold it. He tried to stand against the water because he thought that was what strength looked like. He thought if you held on hard enough to the things you loved, they would stay. But the water is not interested in how hard you hold. The water does what the water does." Verdena was quiet, listening with the full attention she brought to things she intended to remember. "What we know," Prudence said, "what this family knows is that you do not hold the thing you love by gripping it until it breaks. You build something that can move with what comes. You make the loop big enough to travel. You let the rope breathe. And when the water rises, you rise with it. And when it falls, you settle, and you are still here. You are still here." The girl said, "What Ben survives." Prudence looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Where did you hear that?" "Papa says it," the girl said. "When he is working. He says it under his breath like a song." Prudence smiled. "That was a thing Caleb Ashworth said a long time ago." Who was Caleb Ashworth? He was a man who lived on this water for 41 years and never lost his home. He tried to teach your great-grandfather, and your great-grandfather said no. And then your great-grandmother came to him and said yes, and he taught her everything he knew before he died, and she built this house, and now you are sitting on it. Verdena looked at the porch boards under them. These boards, Prudence said. "Well, not exactly these boards. These boards are from the second rebuilding. But this water, these trees, these ropes, yes." The girl leaned back against her chest. The porch rocked very slightly with the movement of the evening current, a slow, easy motion like breathing. "Mama Gran," the girl said, "are you going to die?" "Yes," Prudence said. "Not tonight, but yes." "Are you afraid?" She thought about that honestly, the way she had always tried to answer the children honestly. "No," she said. "I know where home is, and home is where you know how to let the rope breathe." They sat together as the last light left the sky. The lamp came on inside the small house behind them, lit by Colt, who had come in quietly and started the stove without being asked, which was Colt's particular character. The quiet maintenance of things that other people forgot to think about. The water was very still. The 4 ropes held their loops against the 4 trunks, easy and loose, and ready to travel in either direction, as they had for 40 years, as they would for 40 more. Prudence Pembroke's name did not make it into any book or any record beyond a denied petition in Pierrepart Parish Court filed and decided in the autumn of 1903. But somewhere tonight, a woman is being told her home is not a home, and somewhere else, a woman is looking at a rope she has been holding too tight for too long. And the distance between those 2 women is exactly the length of time it takes to understand that what you are protecting is not what breaks when you let go.